Yeah, Paul, I realized this morning that I really don't understand what the DEX is telling me. I'm so
Oh,
used to looking at GEX and looking at our transition zones and looking at that, but it's kind of dawned on me I don't really know what DEX is
yeah.
and how
So
it's telling.
easy answer here. So we know what GEX is, right? Gamma exposure. DEX is delta exposure.
Okay.
Um, so when we talk about DEX, we're really talking about exposed risk that market participants will have at one end of the spectrum or the other. There's a few contrasting differences between GEX and DEX, and how we go about finding a DEX level is different. Um, GEX. So let me kind of start at the top and um, perhaps recall a few salient points that we can think of. Um, so gamma, um, that gamma that we we all play with, um, looks like a bell curve, a normal curve, Poisson distribution or Gaussian distribution, whatever. I don't care what we call it. Normal, right? Normal curve. And throughout the day, what happens is we squeeze that bell curve, and it gets taller and it gets shorter. Um, in fact, on the screen right now, I'll make sure can you guys see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
This was actually captured midday. I didn't refresh the SPX afterward on the app, but you can see the gamma distribution from noon Eastern time, New York time. You can see the gamma distribution very, very clearly, right? It looks like that curve that I was just talking about. Um, why that's important is throughout the day, these zeros and these zeros are going to they're going to start encroaching and get closer and closer and closer to spot price, which is the yellow line here. So what's this got to do with DEX? DEX is a little different, right? So delta doesn't look like a bell curve. In fact, moneyness really impacts delta. Um, and so in the money puts, meaning these puts that are up here, all have a delta that limits towards minus one, excuse me, minus one or minus 100, depending on how you notionalize it. And then the same thing here for the calls. Everything down here is an in the money call, and they limit to plus one or plus 100. I'll go back and forth interchangeably. So why is that important in the context of gamma or gamma exposure? Gamma exposure is really for us, for all intents and purposes, if I turn all these on, for instance, see if I can do that. Yeah, this might be locked out. Gamma exposure, for all intents and purposes, is kind of a representation of convexity starting at the money, and then it, depending on if you're dealing with calls or you're dealing with puts, your convexity is in one direction or the other, but it's very, very close to being at the money or whatever. Um, hence why this peaks out here, and these numbers will continue to grow throughout the session. They'll get bigger and bigger as that balloon gets squashed, as that gamma balloon gets squashed. Delta, on the other hand, it does limit, especially for the zero DT, which I have indicated here. It does limit, but what happens is as it starts limiting, it all of the contracts that are in the money achieve maximum potential. Minus one for the puts and plus one obviously for the calls, times the number of contracts that are at those strikes for the zero DTE. And so when we talk about gamma and we compare it to DEX, the methodologies are different. So your question is specifically DEX. How do we deal with DEX here? Because as spot price moves, moneyness moves, right? And moneyness matters. The influence on delta exposure changes as this line goes up and down. Now, at the line, the gold line, this is the delta exposure of the complex at that moment in time, at that literal, where are we in the overall big picture? But as spot price moves, because we change moneyness, we're actually changing the deltas of the system. Now, you could argue, well, you're doing that for gamma. Why don't you do the same methodology for gamma? Because gamma always is going to be a maximum very, very close to where the spot price is. Delta doesn't always fit that scenario. Delta's maximums are actually out here in the wings, depending on moneyness. And so what we do is we net the two together. We net the calls and we net the puts together. And when we do that, we get the net OI column. So when we're looking at DEX, we're looking at net OI, and really we're answering the question, if price moves to that strike, who's going to be in control? Why does that matter? Let me show you. When spot price moves up into where the green is here, so the green was formed because we took the calls, actually call delta, or call OI, excuse me, and subtract the puts, and we get this net OI. So you can imagine if we had just one contract, one put, one call, and they were at the same strike, they're going to be offsetting, right? The net delta as price is at that by put call parity, they're going to sum to zero. But we have an imbalance. We will always have an imbalance, and that imbalance will drive the net delta in the overall complex as a function of the moneyness. So what we do, Jim, is we take the net OI. And the net OI really drives the total delta exposure within the overall complex. And so what we're looking, when we're finding what those in the morning, when I do my morning analysis and I find the DEX levels, here's exactly what's going on. I look up and down the net OI column for whatever set of expiries that I've got. Sometimes I'll do all of them turned on, right? And I'll look, and you can see very, very clearly that we have a transition that occurs right here at 5,600, 5,605, or 5,600, 5,600, 5,595. Right. That transition is the line in the sand where the delta of the system, independent of how much is above and how much is below, starts to shift more bullish or more bearish. So as price drops towards this, we can start saying, we know that strike is effectively controlled by puts. And we can walk on down and we can see all this red here. And so we know as we get further and further and further down the chain that we're going to start seeing more red appear here. Why does that happen? Because as price drops, we're including more in the money puts and we're rejecting the in the money calls. And so from a net delta perspective, what's really happening is that we're starting to increase the net DEX in the overall system to the negative side. And so when we look at as price falls, we would want to know where are those boundaries. Much like what we do in the GEX transition, we're trying to establish in a DEX transition, where would the areas of change be relevant? So let's go back to the 0DTE, right? Again, midday plot. So this isn't the one I used this morning. I'll call up the one I had this morning. In fact, I think I have it right here. Yeah. But let's just continue the thought experiment right now. So when we call up the 0DTE and we're trying to get an idea where, at what strike, remember the definition of transition. The GEX definition of transition or transition zone is P-trans is that strike and all strikes above it that are call dominated. And N-trans in the GEX definition is that strike at which it and all strikes below it are put dominated. We can apply that same concept here to DEX. And we can ask the same question, But if we used this, it's going to change dramatically as price moves up and down because moneyness changes. We don't want that. We want to know that if we cross a threshold, transition, say P-trans, or excuse me, yeah, P-trans, where are we now going to be call dominated in terms of delta as we move above that? And you can look right at this chart and you can see 56.35, right? 56.35 is that strike at which it and all the strikes above it are call dominated. Same animal applies to the low side. So we ask the same question in GEX. And when we do that in GEX, you can see we've got, some stuff going on over here. But in DEX, if we were to do it in the net OI, we can come up with 55.90. So we know definitively if price moves down to 55.90 and below, that the complex is going to be dominated by puts. And deltas are going to just start shifting. And why is that? Because we know we're going to include more in the money puts as price drops, and it's going to get pretty significant to the downside. And by the same token, to the upside, if we break above P-trans for the DEX, we're going to start including a lot of call delta to the upside because those strikes are dominated by the calls. So what's that do for us? That sets up a transition range of where deltas are either going to be very, very tight, or in this particular case this morning, they're going to be fairly loose. And in the middle is back and forth. And as we see, that's the drunken sailor range, right? We can see movement in that particular area as deltas flip back and forth, as the dealer exposure between P-trans and N-trans actually bounces back and forth. And so the net aggregate gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we hit a threshold to the low side, or we exceed a threshold and start moving to the upside. So does that help? Does that help clarify that?
Yes, that does. And I figured it was very similar to what we did as we drew that box. So everything above it was all, call dominated, everything below was, I just wanted to make sure. And now you've tied the two together for me. So the DEX and the GEX. So
yeah, so for a future release of the web app, we're going to draw the DEX box for you, so you won't have to do it. The algorithm to do that, the machine learning in the background is easy. The rules for DEX are pretty straightforward. And let me just call up a chart that we had earlier today that I think is kind of important to look at here. So here is an example. So this is this morning's, so this is the SPXP. You can see it in the upper left-hand corner. This is all expiries, all turned down, right? So this is the full the SPXP full complex, all expiries turned down. And you can see the white box, which is gamma transition. Right? And the reason that that's gamma transition is you can look up and down net GEX, and you can see there's a strike here where below, well, right here, and it's limited by this. So there, I'll put an asterisk on this, and I'll explain this in a second. So this strike is considered, it's a limiting strike, but it's considered the last strike before you get to minus GEX. And therefore, that's why minus trans is down here. And I'll explain this here in a second. And for P trans for gamma, you can see we go from a red to a green, and then it's green all the way on up. But it would only run the analysis up to here. So here's the asterisk, or here's the exception. Because gamma is a bell curve and it's centered around spot price, as we move up and down, typically what we're going to see, there's going to be a point where negative or minus GEX isn't going to walk up the chain anymore until we get to the last strike that is put dominated. And in this particular case, that would have been this strike. Had price taken off today for whatever, Jay Powell had said and never come back, we would have seen minus GEX most likely shift up to 55.95. Why? because as you get further and further and further up the chain, this gold line is moving up the page. Remember, it looks like a gamma function, right? It looks like a bell curve, I mean. And so what that is going to do is that stuff further away is not going to be, it's not going to have a large amount of gamma. And so the last known put strike would be the last one as this moved far and far away. And we've actually seen that, and you may see that in the 0DTE near the end of the day, where minus GEX is really, really far below us, but it exists, right? It's there. It's kind of pinned. So if you think about what minus GEX is, that's the strongest put dominated gamma in the complex, or negative dominated gamma in the complex. We say put gamma, and I'll explain that here in a second. And PGEX is call dominated gamma, or positive gamma in the complex. Why that becomes a limiting range for gamma, and depending on and the determination of where this white box is dependent on that, is because by definition, P trans has to be at or below wherever that maximum threshold is. There's a 0. And then we go down to NGEX, or the negative GEX. And so it's reasonable in this to have them at the same level, but you couldn't necessarily have an NGEX all the way down lower. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, because eventually you could see, because of that gamma function that we were talking about, there are instances, I don't know why this will flip. Oh, here, this is why I won't flip. There are instances where it could highlight on a level that's really, really far below. So early in our days, a long time ago, years ago, we said NGEX and PGEX are kind of the limiting factors for where N trans and P trans are on the gamma side. Delta doesn't have any of that consideration. Delta is a function of moneyness, and because we have maximum negative delta up here and maximum positive delta down here, we don't limit it, and we allow the delta, basically the delta transition, to be whatever it is. Now, why did I bring this one up from the all expiries today? So cutting to the end here. Gamma, fat, wide, uncertain. Often, most often, DEX transition and GEX transition overlap, and they're usually harmonious and they reinforce each other. Not today. This tells us that the structure is really uncertain, and that was going into FOMC, right? That's the market was pushing in some, pulling on others in terms of puts, calls. They weren't evenly distributed. And at the end of the day, we took the the yellow box. You can see why. So you can see right here where we had the positive level. Again, it's from here all the way on up, all positive values. And then here on down, all negative values. So we took P trans and N trans for deltas off this column, and that's why I drew the box like I drew it. And then you can go look and see why is the box drawn for GEX, and that follows the normal methodology to do this. The takeaway: how do we make money for this, or better yet, how do we protect money? When these things are fat, either one of them, when they're really fat, you need to understand that there's a range in between them, right? Something isn't there. If they're tight, the market's defined, the market knows what it wants to do, it's targeting specific things, and we know how to play it. When it's fat like this, there's uncertainty in the market, and there's going to be levels that are going to stick out like a sore thumb, and it may or may not be hard to move across those levels. And sure enough, you can see there's a gamma level here, or a net OI level here, which is going to give us a lot of gamma to the downside, hence why this is minus GEX. And you can see some other key levels that I pointed out here, but certainly as you walk up this chain, you can understand, or hope you can understand, that there could be a lot of variance that's going on either in the full complex here or in the, let me flip this. Yeah, we'll see what I can get here. I don't know why my machine is so darn slow on some of this. Or in the 0DT, the tightening of the transition shows up here, but we still had a fairly large delta signature there. So hopefully that helps answer that question. And if anything else comes up on this, don't hesitate to to ask a question, and we'll try to explain it.